Okay, kia ora koutou everyone. Welcome to our first workshop after our introductory session on science-based targets, and a particular welcome to all those people on the live stream, to those people in the room who braved the rain, and those who therefore had another option to also go on the live stream. It's lovely to have all of you here. Kia ora koutou, ngā mihi nui kia koe, kia ora e raki te monga, ko Otakaro te awa, ko Ngāti Pākehā ta iwi, ko Rachel Dupree, taku ingoa. Nau mai, haere mai, ki tēnei hui, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Some of you already know I work for the Sustainable Business Council and leading the climate change work program. I've been doing that for what is already 5 months on Kate Alcock's maternity leave. It is flying by, and always when we gather in rooms like this I think of her, because she has had 4 years of work at Sustainable Business Council setting up an amazing climate action program, and we're seeing so much energy around that this year, and so I always like to think of her on these occasions. I'd particularly like to welcome my co-collaborators and conspirators in this project, David Tong from WWF New Zealand, Stu McKenzie from Enviro-Mark Solutions, who is the brains trust behind this operation, and Sean Bowler, who has been helping bring it all together, and today a new staff member for Enviro-Mark Solutions, Kate, who's running the live stream. She is the voice behind the live stream today in terms of responding to all your comments. And last but definitely not least, a big thank you to Courtney, who is today representing all of Sky City, for letting us use this room and providing, I'm sorry live streamers, some fantastic catering in the form of ginormous muffins. So just saying, it's all good at this end. I hope you've got a coffee or something similar down there. Here's the plan for today. A little bit of a welcome from me, over to David to talk about some of the global action that we're hearing about, science-based targets. Stu, who's going to talk about methodologies, emissions inventories. We're going to wrap up with some Q&A, and we'll be out of here by 11:30. All right. Since we last met, just thought I would give you a little bit of an update on the things that we've seen. So firstly, in terms of science-based targets, lots of activity starting to happen. Always a good sign when you see other workshops about science-based targets starting to emerge, and I know Think Step ran a workshop last week on CDP, so reporting against CDP, and had science-based targets as part of that. And certainly in the conversations that I'm having with many of our members and others, there's a lot of talk about what a science-based target is, how do you do it, how long does it take, and hopefully we're going to be able to help keep on demystifying that process through these workshops. David and I have had a chat to the global the representatives around science-based targets, and he's going to share a little bit of insight from that, and I think we're really lucky to have that connection through David, because it means we get directly to them about what their new developments are, and some of the methodological changes that are coming that we're then able to share with you. Also, we did a survey after the last workshop to ask you what you thought of the workshop, and also what questions you still had. And at that time, you told us you wanted to hear more about the methodologies and the process and more examples, and you also wanted more time for questions. So hopefully today we've responded to that. I think another area that's really I'm hearing people talk about is emissions reductions plans, and the confidence that you can feel between setting your long-term target, some of which enters into the realm of the unknown when we're talking 20, 30, 40 and 50, and then how confident you can feel about the plans that you might put in place around that target in order to get there. So we're going to have a bit of a conversation around that today, and in particular we had some questions around the primary sector that we'd also like to address. So this time a lot about methodology. Next workshop we're hoping to get a couple of businesses in the room who we know are working on science-based targets as we speak, in order to share their insights and learnings and be able to kind of talk about those challenges that you have inside a business when you're trying to get people on board and sell them and get your CEOs to commit to yet another thing along the line of all the other things I've already committed to. So that will be next week's in June. So now that you're settled and you've eaten your ginormous muffin, I want to do a little bit of an exercise. There are some charts on the wall here, and this is going to be facilitated to you on the live stream as well. So we start on the left with a chart that says inventory, and we move through to the right, which says a target to 2050 and working on a science-based target. And we'd just like to get a sense of where you're at on that journey. And so what I'm going to ask you to do is grab a post-it note that's on your table, write the name of your organisation on it, and go up there and stick it where you think it best fits. You might want to put it in more than one place, because some of you might have an inventory and you've got a target to 2020, but it's not a science-based one. So that's your task now. When you're ready, you can go and put it up there on the wall so we can get a sense of that. And for those of you on the live stream, Kate's going to flick you a question. Each of the questions from no inventory through to a science-based target, and if that pertains to you, just respond and let her know which one is for you. All right, so I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to do that and to wander over there and stick that up there when you're ready. Okay, thank you everyone, and thank you to those on live stream. I know these workshopy type things aren't always as easy when you're watching from afar, and I think some of your little notes are still coming through, but that's all good. We are getting those posted up. So if we I just wanted to swing around and take a quick look at this. So nice stretch of for targets over the long term, and then you can see here verified inventories, people starting on the journey, and then people working on a science-based target. So quite a nice insight to get a sense of where everyone is and where everyone's working, and also an opportunity if you've got some questions about how to start something or how to set something on a longer term basis, or want to know a little bit about starting on working on a science-based target, you can now see the people who you might want to have a chat to about that. I'm going to hand over to David, whose life is utter chaos at the moment. There is just him working on campaigns for WWF, and as you know, they have such an important role around this kind of time when we're about to see a big piece of legislation emerge for consultation, and he's doing an amazing job at that. And in his spare time, he has signed up to do the K2 twice and something like 100 times around Lake Taupo. It was not quite true, but it's like more than once. So I don't know how he finds time to do all that, but thank you, David, for being here.
I feel like I've been slightly promoted. I'm one of 4 people in our campaigns team, but I lead on our climate change work. So I'm going to give a few updates on a couple of points we conversed with our colleagues internationally about, and then hand over to Stu for the more technical part of the workshop. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Rachel. So, last time our slides had 369 companies that had signed on, committed to take a science-based target. We're now up to 411. This is getting real momentum, more and more, from businesses around the world. 6 companies from New Zealand have signed on to take a science-based target now. 105 companies worldwide from all kinds of sectors have committed to take on science-based targets and had those targets approved. One company in New Zealand has an approved target, Auckland Airport. Those who came to the previous session will have heard about the process they underwent to get there. We had a lot of questions last time about agriculture. We've confirmed there are 2 methodologies available that can be used by agricultural businesses. And there is a new paid service for target validation being introduced. I'll get to that in more detail when I get to that in the slides. So, agriculture. There are 2 methodologies available. So far, there are no agricultural food producers that have an approved science-based target. It'd be amazing if a New Zealand company was the first. But there are 2 methodologies internationally that the Science-Based Targets team have recommended. One is that Ecofis and others have developed a tool and released a report on setting science-based targets for agricultural food production. It would be great if a New Zealand business wanted to try that tool and provide any feedback on how that was for their experience. We want to make sure this is available to all kinds of businesses, including agricultural food product producers. The other, possibly more difficult, possibly simpler approach for agricultural businesses that Paola suggested, from WWF International suggested, is just using the trajectories for methane from the IPCC's most recent assessment report. So those are 2 possible ways for agriculture. Both are ones that are not yet fully tested and that we haven't had an approved business go through yet. But one will be first. It will be amazing if the first was from New Zealand. This is the Ecofis report. So, there is a new validation service. Earlier this month, on the 3rd of May, WWF International and the other science-based targets partners announced that from 2019, from 2019, they would no longer be approving targets, reviewing companies' targets for free. This year, the current service still exists. If you submit a target before the end of August, you can have a free validation beginning before August and one free validation in the period August through December. If you submit a target after August, you can choose to have one free validation or a paid validation. And the fee for a New Zealand business, for many of us, will be pretty high. It's $5,000 US. That's why we want to support as many businesses as possible in New Zealand to get through the free validation process in 2018. And I want to stress this is something that we did not know about when we ran the last workshop. It's a new development this month. And that from the international partners' perspective, this is absolutely not a fundraising exercise. It's cost recovery because with 500 businesses in the pipeline, they're resource constrained. So, the current validation service. Companies can submit their targets for approval for free once between September and December. Anything before the end of August doesn't count towards this limit of one free validation. You can make a preliminary submission before the 31st of August that doesn't count to this limit of one free validation. You will receive written feedback on your target. Normally, it will take around 40 business days for validation. It's longer if it's contentious. For a company to be validated, there needs to be consensus between the partner organisations. And so if it's a novel sector, or if it's an area where there's a disagreement between the partner organisations, then it can take longer. We, at WWF New Zealand, we can liaise with our colleagues overseas to try to expedite that process. That's both in terms of time and in terms of highlighting to those overseas when there's a real strategic importance in getting a particular New Zealand business or businesses through. We've already said to Paola that this year it's really a strategic moment for New Zealand with the Zero Carbon Bill and with New Zealand having been identified by WWF International as a priority country for lobbying in our international positioning around the UNFCCC and the Talanoa dialogue. So we can try to open some doors if your businesses do want to get any written feedback or oral feedback before August and before submitting a target. But from August, there's also a new validation process where for US 5000, you can get up to 2 assessments, not 1, a comprehensive target validation report, so a more detailed written report, and up to 2 hours of feedback conversations with someone from the international validation team. So those feedback conversations are likely to be the most valuable thing. And we can, as I said, I can try to organise a Skype call with me or a Zoom call with me and someone from the validation team for a business that doesn't choose to go down this route. But that may become more difficult after August. If you'd like feedback informally from the international validation team, let's see if we can arrange that before August, because we're already in the process of organising that for one business. They've made the offer, but what happens once it becomes a paid service is still to be tested. So this is the information on the website about the new service for the validation. If I've run through it once over lightly or a bit too quickly, just go to the Science Based Targets website and it's under the Frequently Asked Questions page. That's my quick update. Over to Stu for the more expert stuff, unless there are any questions on those updates I've passed on. Yes.
I was wondering if you knew of more methodologies than for agriculture available for science-based targets.
Absolutely, and I'm going to make a quick hospital pass over to Stu for that, I think, because he, I know in his presentation, talks about different approaches to target setting, and one is the sectoral decarbonisation approach.
The validation, is that an annual requirement or just an initial requirement?
It's a one-off requirement.
And you have to have CDP, I understand, so you have to, if you don't have that already, you have to pay for that, and then there's also the validation cost on top of post-August.
You don't have to, my understanding is you don't have to be a CDP member to go through validation.
Okay, so in this session today I'd like to just do a brief refresher on what I talked about last time on the process, and then I'll get into the detail about what sort of key actions you need to consider for drafting up your submission, and then I'll follow up with some recommendations for next steps from there. Feel free to ask some questions during my talk. If I can't answer it straight away, we'll just put it on the parking board from there. Okay, so the process. So step one, you're basically submitting a commitment letter with your company details and what sector you're operating in. It is basically a 1 or 2 pager there. And then you work on developing a target, which is your step 2. Okay, so first off, you're needing to choose a methodology, which I'll talk about in more detail later on. And then, as David alluded to, in terms of drafting up your submission, we do recommend that you have that unofficially validated first to make sure you're on the right track. Then step 3 is when you actually submit your target for validation, and the verification team will then assess it and get back to you whether you've confirmed whether the target's there or whether you need to resubmit a revised target. Step 4 is about announcing and communicating your target. You do get some communications assistance with that, and I'll also add to that this is when you need to think about monitoring how you're going against your targets over the longer term as well. Okay, so submitting the commitment letter, it's basically downloading that form, putting in your company information, and you need to be aware that once you've done this, you're committing to submitting a target within 2 years. Okay, so that's publicly listed. So one thought I had about this is you might want to actually consider drafting up some of your target first in your official submission form, just to make sure you've got confidence in being able to submit before you then go and say, okay, let's submit our commitment letter. So developing a target. So first off, you need to look at your inventory and decide if it's suitable, and also whether it's covering an appropriate base year, which I'll talk about soon, and time periods from the base year onwards. Okay. So for the inventory to be suitable, it should be following the GHG protocol or ISO 14064. For any organisations that are measuring on the CMARS or Carbon Zero program, you are compatible to that because the program meets those standards. And in a practical sense, it's worth having your inventory in a report form, such as a Word document, and supporting data files so that you've got it there for future transparency and reference. So there's no specific requirement to get your inventory peer reviewed or externally verified, but I do recommend that you do this because the impact on your targets could be considerable if there's any errors or gaps, and you want to have it right for publicising your commitments over that long term. So, do you have a suitable inventory? So, first off, your current inventory is your current inventory reflecting the boundaries of what you're wanting to submit in terms of joint ventures, subsidiaries. You might have different geographic sites, especially if you've got operations overseas as well. Are you going to have them within the scope of your target? So if you're following the GHG protocol, you would have already dealt with how you're setting your organisation's scope there. And then you move on to saying, okay, where are you sourcing your data from? Will you be able to consistently source this data? Because we're talking about a sort of 5 to 15 year period for those targets. And ideally looking at improving your data quality over time as well. And have you got all this documented so that if somebody takes over your role in terms of monitoring the inventory, will that be replicable? So again, over that 15-year period, staff changes might occur. And then also consider your emission factors. So for your Scope 1 and 2 emissions are generally going to be okay because you can reference to publications like the MFE factor set. But you might want to do more due diligence around your Scope 3 factors, especially for your more obscure emission sources. And are there opportunities to improve your inventory accuracy through either developing your own factors or sourcing other Scope 3 factors available from published reports? So your inventory does need to have all your Scope 1 and 2 emissions. The only exception here is if you've got small emission sources that are considered to be de minimis, and that's generally referred to as emissions that are less than 1% of your inventory. Now on one of the recent SBT webinars, I learned that 50% of the rejected submissions are related to either base year setting, scope setting, or insufficient significance thresholds for those Scope 1 and 2 emissions. And then another 40% of rejected submissions was due to Scope 3 related errors. So things such as no Scope 3 screening assessment being done, which I'll talk about in the next slide, no Scope 3 boundary being set, or no Scope 3 targets. So you need to make sure you're covering off on this. So for Scope 3 emissions on this slide here, I've got the Scope 1 and 2 in the middle here, and then you might already be measuring some of your Scope 3 emissions, which I've just put in here as Scope 3 measured. But then you've got all the rest. So you've got further upstream and further downstream, and these are usually referred to as your supply chain emissions, Scope 3 supply chain emissions. Okay. So within the supply chain, the GHG protocol refers to these as 15 main categories, and you'll probably find that some are less significant than others in your operations, but essentially you do need to work through these and work out whether these are going to be applicable, because you need to end up understanding whether your Scope 3 emissions are greater than 40% of your total inventory and whether you need to bring that into your targets. So the GHG protocol here does have a publication on guidance and also technical guidance on calculating your emissions. And in practice you might find yourself using a combination of sort of top-down estimation methods, for example using dollar spend, and then bottom-up methods such as using kilometres travelled or tonnes of waste going to landfill for calculating those emissions. Any questions so far? Okay, so you might be thinking, well, how do we actually understand what our Scope 3 emissions are, because there's potential for this exercise to really balloon out, because you might be looking at hundreds or thousands of supplier or emissions sources, because at the most detailed level you're essentially trying to work out your emissions for every component of the supply chain from cradle to grave. So the guidance talks, I'm referring to the GHG protocol guidance, talks about quantitative and a qualitative approach. So for the qualitative approach, we're talking about considering your emission sources or supplier codes in terms of saying, okay, do you have the ability to influence those emissions? How important is it to your stakeholders? Is it outsourced operations that you previously did in-house? And also, another, I think is a key one is, is there any other sector guidance or precedents within your sector in terms of what's being measured? And so you might consider using a bit of a matrix table type system for going through and checking those ones. But then you also need to do a quantitative, well actually you don't necessarily need to do the qualitative approach as well, but you do need to do the quantitative approach to work out that 40% threshold. Okay, so because you need to set targets for the top 3 categories or the top 2/3 of your Scope 3 emissions if they're in your scope. So to do a quantitative method, I'm suggesting first look at your expenditure data. So there is a data set available from a UK DEFRA reference for estimated emissions per dollar spend. Obviously appreciating that there's some uncertainties, quite a bit of uncertainty around that. It is a high level estimate only because you're needing to make assumptions around allocating your cost codes to the factors that are available, and also it's UK based data. Now there is also another tool online called Qantas, which is talked about and referred to. That works on a similar approach where you're plugging in your dollar spend data for different categories, and then that will produce an output as well, similar to this. So you want to end up with an idea in terms of where your emissions are occurring across those 15 supply chain categories. And this example here, we've got the top 3 being purchased goods and services, capital goods, and fuel and energy activities, and as you see there's some that don't feature at all. Okay. You might also be able to check if there's any relationship between dollars spent and the size of the emissions. So for the science-based targets, you don't have to further develop any fully comprehensive supply chain review, but they do encourage working towards it. So what that means is that if there's a dollar spend relationship, you might be able to prioritise trying to improve your emissions inventory by focusing on those bigger expenditure codes first and then moving down the list from there. And so some next steps from there you could do is things like creating a questionnaire for your suppliers or your key suppliers for getting more accurate data on your emissions calculation. You might also see an opportunity to incorporate emissions considerations into the tendering process to make sure that gets appropriate weighting. And that you might also remember from the last session that that is actually what some of the companies are doing. The validated companies are saying, okay, we want to encourage 80% of our suppliers to be setting science-based targets by the year 2025 or year 2030, for example.
Live stream audience here, and it's from Sam Bridgman, and the question is, our Scope 3 are completely integrated into our business, so rather than make specific targets that separate Scope 3, can we make business-wide targets that also happen to capture Scope 3 emissions?
Yeah, hi Sam. Yeah, so the reading up on SBT is that you do need to set Scope 1 and 2, but you can have a combined Scope 1 and 2 and 3, all the same target percentage, but you do need to clearly define the difference between those Scope 1 and 2 and 3 totals. Yeah, so there is some, I'm pretty sure it was on the FAQ section of the SBT website that talks about that. And there is some examples of validated companies where they've set all scopes together. Okay, so quite a bit of detail on this slide, but it's just to illustrate some other potential data options for calculating those 15 categories of emissions. And this is referred to sources such as the CDP supply chain entries. You might have sales information or product design data that you can then link back to an emissions calculation. And then there might be, you might actually have suppliers that have specific emission factors or data already available.
Just wanted to ask from a retail perspective with doing the scope 3 in terms of suppliers. So if you've got hundreds, if not thousands of suppliers, obviously you've talked about requesting information from the suppliers, but for a lot of suppliers they're not at that stage yet. So the dollar spend would be the option that you would go for. I'm just thinking that if you're a growing business and your spend is increasing, getting a willingness from them to commit to setting science-based targets is going to be, a challenge for those businesses.
Yeah,
any
that's
thoughts
right.
on that, or any?
Yes.
Have you got any kind of examples of retail businesses and how they're working through this?
Yeah, so I think, in my opinion, it comes back to this relationship. Like from my experience with doing Scope 3 screening, is that there is often a relationship between dollar spend and emissions. So it's a case of focusing on those. It might even just be starting off with the top 10 suppliers by your cost code and seeing what sort of willingness there is there. And I guess it also comes down to what level of influence you have over those suppliers, how important they are to your business. And then just working down from there. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, so it's a stage process.
Yeah.
You can approach it in that way.
Yeah. And like I say, it's like for the purpose of the SBTs, you're not actually required to develop a really fully comprehensive Scope 3 assessment. You just need to get to the point where you understand whether you need to actually set targets for Scope 3, and then you can move down that track.
There was another question from Nina Campbell on live stream. So it's just going back to the scopes. So this means we're obliged to do Scope 3 emissions in order to participate, or can we start with Scope 1 and 2 and then work towards Scope 3 later?
That I do recall seeing that on the guidance. I'm pretty sure they did say they need to have all three together. It does have to be considered. Yeah, but if we can just park that one, I might be able to get a proper response to that one, because it was definitely covered in the guidance.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so moving on to time periods. So essentially the recommendation is to set your most recent 12-month period as your base year. But do keep in mind, you do have an option for averaging your baseline over several years. So I've seen averages over, say, a 3-year baseline. But most companies that I've seen that are getting validated, they're just having a single base year. Okay. But the purpose of having the most recent 12-month period is to avoid the situation where, for example, if you have a 2010 base year and you've had all these achievements up to the present time now, and you set a target, is to make sure that you're actually going to carry on having more targets and reductions from this point forwards. Okay. And also keep in mind that we're talking about 5 to 15 year time horizons for the target date. So do refer to the GHG protocol in terms of managing any significant changes to your business, because that will affect your base year as well, or could affect your base year. So these are some examples of what base years are occurring for companies that are already validated. So you'll see the 2015 period, which will be a reflection of when the SBT was set up and the first wave of companies coming through. But there is a tail of earlier ones as well. Okay, so you need to decide on a method. So there is several available. But the latest guidance from SBT is that they recommend using either a sector-based method or absolute-based method. And at the moment, the SDA is the only one of that kind. So you might recall from the last session too that there's a recommendation to have targets in both absolute and intensity forms as well. So just for a bit of background, I checked out what sort of targets you'd end up with. Oh, sorry, Adam. Do you have a question, Adam?
Sorry, we've got a question.
Did you say it was absolute and intensity? You have to have both.
You don't have to have both, but they recommend having a combination. Yeah. Sorry. Okay. So I checked out what sort of targets you'd end up with using all the different methods, which I've shown in the table here. And this is just based on our own Enviro-Mark solutions data. So you'll see there's quite a bit of variation. It's actually quite difficult to compare the results across the methods because the KPI metrics and target states are different, which is a reflection of the calculation models available. And it's possibly a reason why that top one, for example, 3% solution, it's not essentially recommended by SBT because it only works between 2010 and 2020. That's how the model works. Okay, and so we're just focusing on this SDA and absolute approach for that one. So just a bit more explanation on the SDA method. So it's based on allocating sector by sector emission reduction pathways that converge on a desired emission level by the year 2050. Okay, so as you see here in this example, it's about realigning the business as usual activity in the sector down to that 2 degrees emissions trajectory. Now, these trajectories have been developed for major emission intensive industries first, so there might not be an option directly applicable to your sector just yet. And so as David said in the last slide, that the agriculture one does have some options now as well. So as you can appreciate, each company within a sector will have their own targets to achieve by the year 2050. But the idea is that each company ends up at the overall sector area. So the green line is an individual business working down towards that sector target, and then we've got the overall sector emissions coming down as well, so they all converge at the year 2050. So to apply your chosen method, obviously first off, confirm what sort of data you need, which I'll explain. Run your calculations and then see what your targets look like. And of course then you'll see whether they're feasible to achieve. Are they in line with any existing best practice or other industry examples? And will you get your management approval for that? So there'll be an element of peer review to get consensus on if those targets are appropriate for you. So for the SDA method, you're essentially needing to get the calculation template, download the template from the link there. And first thing in the worksheet is you need to select your sector, and I'd suggest liaising with the SBT team in terms of what the best selection is for your situation in your sector, because there's a few options to choose there. And you might not have a sector available for you as well, and that might help your decision in terms of what method you use too. So then you need to enter your base year scope 1 and 2 emissions and your KPI base year data. So you'll need to do a bit of forecasting for your KPI data because it's dependent on what your activity levels are going to be. And the type of KPI data depends on what sector you choose, but it might be, for example, metres squared of floor area occupied. Other options might be tonnes of product output. But once you've done that, the calculation tool will calculate the results, and then you can do your sense checking from there. For the absolute approach, essentially you choose your emission scenario first, because that dictates what percentage you need to achieve by the year 2050. And the recommendation is RCP 2.6 scenario, which translates through to 72% by 2050. Now, if you want to go for a straight linear approach for that, the equation is basically 72% divided by the number of years you've got between your base year and your target year. You can also consider a more aggressive or compound approach where you set higher annual targets at the start and then taper off later on, just making sure that you're still reaching that 72% by the year 2050. And you might recall in the last presentation, the compound or aggressive approach is the preferred one because it achieves the most emission reductions over the long term. So we've got the pathway B is that more aggressive approach, and pathway A is the linear, and the emissions occurring underneath that line. So if you take, for example, a 2017 base year, then the targets come out like what I've got on the table here. So if you've got, for example, a 2030 target using the linear approach, you're wanting to get 28% reduction. And then if you're doing a more aggressive approach, it might be around 46%, and that's for the totals. So you can see on the time series, that translates to, for the linear approach, 2.18% per year. And then the other option, aggressive, I've just chosen to say, okay, let's do 5% and then taper off to 1% after the year 2030. And now, just to confirm, this is for scope 1 and 2 emissions. So you can then also translate that through to what your expected tonnes of emissions might look like as well, through a function, just through percentage there. Now, if your base year is later, so for example, if it's the year 2020, then of course your linear target will go up. So in this example, it would go up to 2.4% per year, so you get less time to achieve that. Okay, so once you've calculated your targets, you'll need to ask whether it's practical to achieve them. So I'd recommend looking at your targets and say maybe yearly time series, or it might be 5 yearly blocks, and then lining up your planned reduction opportunities against that timeline to see if it will actually help achieve the targets. Now, you might need to appreciate that, given the long timescale, you might need to anticipate some of the emerging or over the horizon opportunities that are a little bit uncertain in terms of whether they're going to they'll work, but have a bit of faith that some of those will be feasible within your operation. So you might want to have several of those sort of over the horizon technologies or opportunities, on the assumption that some might not come into fruition, but some will be applicable in time for you. So you'll have your own preferences in terms of how you document essentially your reduction pathway. Well, this is an example of what I mean. So I'm just showing this in a bit of a granular level. So I've charted the emissions by business unit and emission source here on the left. And then I've set basically sub-targets for each emission source with a rationale as to how that can be achieved, and also the target date. So I've got a mixture of early 2018, 2020, 2025 through to 2025. And so you might do that through your inventory. And I've done this in a worksheet so that you can then have a formula that sort of does a weighted average aggregation up to say, okay, well, if all those sub-targets are achieved, we will hit our target of minus 48% or whatever it happens to be. And so if you have a worksheet like this, you can play around with those subtotals, change them, mix them up, and then see how that affects your final total. Okay, and then of course see if that target there aligns to your calculations that you've done in the STA or the absolute model.
Excuse me, Stu, we have another question from the live stream audience, and this question is from either from Anthony at Z Energy or Sam Bridgman, can't quite make it out. But the question is, was that calculation spreadsheet that you showed 2 slides back from the tool?
2 slides back. This one is just in a worksheet, and it's just using this formula here. So it's just, I've just applied it in the formula there. Yeah.
And we have another question as well from Janelle Palmer at Contact, which is, do we need the rationale as part of the science-based targets verification process?
I don't believe you do. That's a good question. I guess if you've got some rationale behind how you're going to achieve your target, it will be useful in supporting the submission. But in terms of the submission form, there's not essential requirements for that. Okay, so just working on, taking this data, I've just put it into a pictorial form. So you'll see the milestones working down, so achieving a 14% reduction by the year 2020, 16% by 2025, and then 48% through by 2030. And I've just charted on there, what sort of actions should get us there. Okay, so I'd suggest that a graph like this could be useful potentially for submitting, when you're communicating with your management for getting sign off on this, just to illustrate how you're actually going to get there and achieve it. Okay. And so here's just another example, same approach, but just using putting livestock into the mix. So for an inventory with say 40% livestock and fertiliser emissions, 20% fuel, 35% freight and 5% other.
We're talking about emissions reductions. Are we talking gross or net? I'm sorry, I missed on the first workshop.
Yeah, we're talking about gross emissions.
Gross emissions.
Yeah.
So the pathways you've described could not be accounted for with offsets, for example.
Yeah, you're not allowed to use offsets in your science-based target. Yeah. So if we take this example and just look at the scope 1 and 2 emissions, so we might be able to aim for around a 17% reduction just through things like electric vehicles and energy efficiency methods. So that is actually a little bit lower than like what the 28% would be for an absolute approach. So do appreciate that, but in this instance in the ag sector you might be looking at putting a case around sector best practice, or intensity metrics aligning with the SDA approach that EcoFIS has put out, that David showed in the other slides. But that could be an option. And that's again just charting this in a pathway sort of sense. So we've got coming down to 17% through energy efficiency measures and then maintaining that. Okay. It's also worth pointing out that for things like scope 3, like freight emissions, there's a lot of freight companies that are setting science-based targets that are committing to, say, between 15 and 50% emission reductions or savings. So that should flow through to low emission intensity freight options for companies like yourselves. So, for example, in this example where there's a 35% freight footprint, then you should be able to actually lower your freight footprint simply by choosing lower emissions intensive freight companies. And so keep that in mind for if you need to set your scope 3 targets in your submission. So that leads on to scope 3. So once you've done your scope 3 screening, you'll know whether you actually need to set these targets. But if you do, so just to recap, you do need to set a target for at least the top 3 of those 15 supply chain categories, or the top 2/3 of your total scope 3 emissions estimated. So the order of priority is shown here, but I think in a practical sense, the level you go to in terms of the priority of target does come down to the level of detail you've got available to actually calculate a target. So probably comes down to data availability and then just trying to apply the basic principles of your SMART targets if possible. So I've covered a bit there, so hopefully that covers some extra content that you need to know. But just to summarise, so in terms of next steps, so first off, review your inventory, and it's great to see the different stages people are at on the wall there. Then do some scope 3 screening, work out whether you need to include that in your target, and then start running your target calculations, see what they look like, do they look achievable, and then at some point you need to decide about committing to or submitting a commitment letter. And like I say, you might want to consider doing your commitment letter and drafting some of your submission form first, and then going from there. Okay. So open up for questions from here.
The targets only binding for the company setting them. So we are a subsidiary company of a larger group. If we set targets, does it have an impact on our mother company?
No, it doesn't. There's some specific questions in the submission form that talk about, is your parent company already setting science-based targets? And also the other way around, if you're a parent company with subsidiaries, it's clarifying whether you're actually submitting targets for your subsidiaries as well. Yeah.
So, Stu, we have another question from the live stream audience, and it's from Nina Campbell at ECA. Can we access the target setting tools before we submit the commitment letter?
Yes, you can. Yes. They're freely available. Yep. So just access them through the links on the slide that I showed there. We are going to send the slides around. Yep.
And can I just add to that, because some of you weren't here, but some of you were, but last time when Martin spoke to us in the first introductory workshop, as someone who had experience of the first experience in New Zealand of setting these for business when he was at Auckland Airport, he strongly recommended going through that process and understanding your levels of buy-in in your company and where all your challenges might be in terms of getting people over that line before you got to that verification place. And it will depend a little bit on your company. Some of you will work in a place where they like you to make a commitment first and then you work out how you're going to get there second, and for others of you, knowing how you're going to get there first is more important than and then making the commitment. Obviously, from our New Zealand Inc. point of view, the more of us as business we have on the map around science-based target setting, the more it raises our leadership position in a marketplace which is looking to New Zealand for some leadership. But on the other hand, you need to be practical about taking the time it takes to get all of your various stakeholders over the line, which is often no mean feat. Can I just say also, this is it. You've got 20 minutes for questions, so don't be shy. Anything you'd like to ask, if we don't know, we'll find out from someone who does and reflect it back in the notes afterwards, but please do make the most of the question time.
So when David talked about the IPCC for agriculture, it covered methane and not nitrous oxide. Nitrous oxide is roughly 25%, and it's probably one of the ones that's actually more achievable for reductions than methane. So just wondering if the other system, the EcoFIS, does have more of a nitrous oxide component to it.
Yeah, so now I'll just be honest here, I'm still getting my head around these two new methodologies, but for the EcoFIS one, it does cover all the gases. So just to clarify, so EcoFIS is working on a SDA type approach, so it's reducing your emissions per tonne of product output, whether it's in the dairy sector, the meat and I think it's divided by beef, poultry, pork, those sort of key areas. But it does cover the nitrous oxide and methane separately. Yeah.
Okay, so can you just, Stuart, thank you for that. It was really very, very good, and I actually think that we could use this sort of approach for our DHB. So where do we start? How do we start? Is it an engagement with our staff, the key leads of our staff, to get an idea of what we want to measure, or how do we get going, basically?
Yeah, so Manjula, for your situation, you're obviously on the CMAS program, you've got a verified inventory, which is great. Some of the key steps from there is, like you say, to get that commitment from management if you do want to do it. But also, I think the Scope 3 screening is quite a useful one to consider, because that'll indicate where you need to put efforts around target setting as well. And then it is a case of really getting in and exploring what sort of targets you might need to set, using the methodologies there that I've mentioned.
Does this require senior management sign-off, I mean, obviously it's something that's going to be formalised, isn't it?
Yeah, it depends on your company, your organisation policies. But I think it's worth just keeping in mind that this is eventually going to be publicly listed. It's going to be on the SBT website. I think by default it ends up on the couple of the other websites as well, the CDP as well, possibly. But yeah, so it's whatever is required for management to be happy that this is going to be a public statement and your commitment is out there. People are going to see it.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that whole process, how long does it take?
Okay, so that's probably a difficult one. I mean, our own Enviro-Mark Solutions one we submitted last year, but we're a small company, so we're still waiting for our validation. But then, can you recall how long the Auckland Airport was when Martin said last time?
So 40 working days is normal?
Yeah.
It's not about the size of the company, it's about the difficulty of the assessment in the sector. Sorry, so around 40 working days is normal for the validation and approval process. It's not primarily about the size of a company, it's about the sector. And so for a company like Enviro-Mark Solutions, it's a novel sector which raises new and interesting questions that has made that more challenging than it would be for most other New Zealand businesses' assessments. 40 working days is the international estimate from submission to receiving feedback and a result.
And yeah, so you got your 40 working days, and then you got the time to prepare your submission. So I think I can't really estimate the time to prepare the submission, but we're probably talking a few months. Just depending on your resources.
We have two questions from the live stream audience here, and the first one is from Selva Ganapathy, and the question is, according to you, who is, understand, a student at the University of Canterbury, according to you, what should be the role of universities in helping businesses set up SBT and achieving them? Are we in touch with any universities?
Sorry, are we
in touch with any universities? So this question, if I'm interpreting it correctly, Silva, is around the role of university and academia in helping and working with business on science-based targets.
If you've got the expertise and the knowledge, I don't see why not. And especially, I'm just thinking, especially in the area of improving Scope 3 estimates, for example. Scope 3 is such a big space, and organisations have got such a big area of influence around Scope 3. It's often that big part of the footprint that just doesn't get looked at, simply due to data availability. So if universities are able to actually provide more either calculation models or databases or things like that, then that'll definitely help.
Thank you. And thank you for that question, Silva. Another question from Nina Campbell at ECA, which is, are there materials available on the SBT website that could be used to explain the process, or in fact, possibly the question is, where can we get materials that could be used to explain this process and the value proposition for a pitch to management? How do we sell this to management, and where are those tools? Maybe
I might ask David
might
about
have
that
the
one,
answer
actually.
too.
David, so the question is around pitching or promoting it to management to get management buy-in in terms of communication materials?
I don't think there are any internal communications resources on the website, but I think that's something that will be useful to develop in future. And it would also be interesting to see whether other businesses in New Zealand that are going through the process have any tips and feedback and materials that could be shared. One thing that could be difficult on an international website is that management culture from country to country can vary quite significantly. So what works really well in one country for internal communications might not work so well in another country.
There is a lot of FAQs on the website, and it's quite well filtered out for the different subject areas. So I'd recommend having a look at that FAQ section. It could answer some things there too.
Hi there. I have got a bit of a question. Might be slightly controversial in the context of the topic here. Good lead in. But the question is around, and it actually leads on to the business case and the value for business of setting a science-based target. Has anyone got any thoughts on what's the value of seeking validation for a science-based target, or purely going ahead for a target based on a science-based methodology, particularly thinking about the costs that might be coming up? What's the return for business? What does that look like? Still committing to the same sort of outcome, but what process do you follow and that kind of thing? I don't know if you've got an answer, but I'd be really interested in some perspective.
I'm not sure if I can really get an answer on that one, but I guess it would be the similar example or situation of going for, say, ISO certification or any of those other sort of standards, and then putting a public statement out there and then stakeholders challenging it. So I guess it comes down to the level of risk you want to take on in terms of making a public statement and then having people say, well, hang on, you're not actually officially certified or validated to that process. Yeah.
I'll have a view on that, since I just want to have a view on that. No, I don't think it's too much different to the decisions that you all make every day in your businesses around developing up your inventory. At what stage do you want to have it verified or audited? There are a number of companies in New Zealand who have already publicly talked about in their reports setting a target using the science-based approach, but haven't necessarily gone on to have that validated. And I think setting a target using a science-based approach is better than plucking a target out of the air. Having said that, I've been in places where we've done that, and that's also okay, because then it rallies resources and people around that, and it was perhaps an approach that we used, in the past and not so much now. And I also think it depends on, where you're at in that business journey of engagement and buy-in, and moving ahead and setting a science-based target and being able to do the work around that is as important as being able to, to get the validation piece at the end. And you want to set it up so that you can, but starting it's really important. And I think the hurdle of validation shouldn't stop the process starting, but I think you need to aim towards that. And I know that might be a somewhat controversial thing to say with Stu and David in the room. I think the other thing is there are risks around saying you've got one and not had it validated. There's also benefits for you internally in terms of just if the validation's the barrier, but you can get on the journey anyway. Getting on the journey is important. But there's obviously benefits in saying that you've got a validated one because it's more robust and all those other things that you already experience when you have validated inventories. So it's just one of those things you inherently assess in the business depending on what your buy-in is, where your journey is, where your expertise is, and where your resources are.
Seems like this is the question that's going to get all of us on stage. So I guess from our perspective, I think there are two really important things with going through the approval process. One is that a lot of businesses internationally have submitted things for approval and been turned down on their first go. And so a lot of businesses think they have a science-based target, but our international experts say, no, that doesn't line up with a trajectory for 2 degrees. So you can say you have a science-based target, and I will echo everything Rachel said about getting on the journey and that being incredibly important on its own. But a big part of the journey is having an independent set of eyes looking over it and checking it against an objective standard. And so what the international validation process can provide, on one level, is an objective standard. The second thing is communications. Step 4 on the science-based targets kind of process, the last stage, is communicating your target. We haven't been able to do this yet as WWF New Zealand because of the timing with Auckland Airport, but we are so excited to be able to sing the praises of a New Zealand business getting a science-based target. That means, one, you've got the Panda and other international brands lining up behind your business and supporting what you're doing. It also means, we've all seen businesses setting emissions reduction targets and then getting Rod Oram or other business or other journalists or NGOs like us or Greenpeace or 350 standing up and tearing down that target. If we're standing as WWF beside you saying this is a science-based target, it's much, much less likely that other civil society organisations or environmental journalists or others will criticise that target, because you've got that independent brand, independent validation, and also you've got our networks into civil society, meaning we can say, hey, please don't attack them, they're doing a good thing. So for that, it's the objective assessment and the ability for us to communicate what you're doing and highlight it to consumers, and also to stop those who criticise what you're doing from criticising what you're doing.
End it there. We've got another question which relates exactly to what you've said and the credibility of the targets from the live stream audience, and the audience member is asking that if a target is actually accepted by science-based targets, does that mean that the target is necessarily robust, or will SBT endorse a less ambitious or timid target?
It means that SBT considers that that target is equivalent to that business's fair share of getting to 2 degrees, or well below 2 degrees. And so I'd be very surprised to see a less ambitious or timid target being authorised. Potentially, what is timid or less ambitious is a value judgment, right? And so potentially there would be some sectors where it's easier and harder to get in line with 2 degrees. And so for some it might be easier to reach that threshold than others. But the Science-Based Targets program will not authorise a target that is not in line with the science for getting us to a 2 degree future.
Thank you. There's another question from the floor here, but just before we go to that, just want to acknowledge the live stream audience members, and there seems to be a theme coming through some of the discussion on the live stream that there is a need for community and information sharing, and already some people in the live stream audience are connecting with each other around that, but certainly bringing people together to solve some of these challenges and answer some of these questions could be very, very useful. So a question from Michael here.
Thanks, Sean, and thanks for the presentation so far. It's been really good. 3 things, really. First of all, I guess in my mind it's really important that you get down this sort of path of getting an inventory and getting that inventory verified so that you've got a real good starting point for that. And I don't know what everybody knows about that, but people like Deloitte and EY and that can do that sort of verification. It's reasonably straightforward. It's a protocol to follow, so that's not too big a difficult task. Second thing, question, probably a philosophical one and a technical one. The first one is why 2 degrees and why not 1.5? Because it seems like what a lot of stuff is coming around now is saying that 2 degrees is possibly not ambitious enough. And then the second one is the involvement of Scope 3 in this process. If I look at Deloitte's emissions, 80% of our emissions are flight related, largely through Air New Zealand. Shameless promotion for Air New Zealand, great partner. If they go and set a target, and we set a target, and we set our target predominantly on our Scope 3, and they set a target on their Scope 1, which is the flights that they provide to us, how's that getting, how's that science-based? That seems like it's just flat out double counting.
So you will get situations where you're double accounting and targets will be overlapping. But like I say, like I said in the freight example, if you're supporting an air travel provider or a freight provider that's got a target to reduce their emissions, then you're reducing your Scope 3 footprint, which is great, meeting your targets there, and then they're reducing their Scope 1 footprint, which is what we're trying to achieve too. So in my opinion, it's covering covering off on the emissions that you need to be doing, and in terms of the global atmosphere, it's ticking all the boxes. Does that answer your question? Or? I think the key thing is to accept that there's going to be double accounting here, because any Scope 3 emission is doubling up on someone's Scope 1.
I just worry that it might be, if New Zealand's doing a really good job of that, we might be better off focusing our effort somewhere else rather than doubling up on what they're doing. Over that long time period that we're looking, so the next 20 or 30 years.
So that comes down to monitoring and reviewing those where your emissions are occurring. And so if you find that your air travel footprint ends up being coming from 80% down to 20% of your footprint, or whatever, then that's where you do start focusing on other areas of where you can influence other areas of your business. Other emission profiles.
Try answering that question a different way. Because from the perspective, I think, of the science-based target partner organisations, there are some businesses whose Scope 3 emissions represent the vast majority of their emissions. And so if you, as a business, only cut your Scope 1 and 2 emissions, when they make, say, 20% of your total emissions and 80% are Scope 3, well, then you're not really cutting your emissions, particularly if your Scope 3s grow, to offset the shrinking Scope 1 and Scope 2. So casting the net widely to include the Scope 3s means that you're covering all the bases. And there are differences in the target setting for most businesses on the Scope 1 and 2 and the Scope 3. So for a lot of your businesses, the question on Scope 3 is not, do you have a percentage reduction target for your Scope 3s? It's, have you considered your Scope 3s adequately? Do you have a plan in place to deal with your Scope 3s? Unless your Scope 3s make up a really big proportion of your business's overall emissions. Then the second half of that question is the 1.5 versus 2 degrees one. And this goes back to the ending decisions in Paris. Partially it goes back to the development of the Science-Based Targets Initiative in the period leading up to Paris. I was, in my past life, I did my master's on the Paris Agreement. And up until I was in Paris, I don't think anyone, I never expected, nobody I knew expected to get the words 1.5 degrees into the Paris Agreement. So that was a really lovely surprise for a lot of people. And it was something where I saw Pacific Island negotiators crying tears of joy that they got 1.5 into the Paris Agreement. So part of it was the timing of when the Science-Based Targets Initiative developed. The other part is the really bizarre, complex double target in the Paris Agreement, which is aiming to get limit warming to well below 2 degrees, or ideally 1.5 degrees. And so science-based targets is catching the well below 2 degrees part. And we would, WWF, all the partner organisations, would absolutely encourage and welcome businesses that want to go that bit further to the 1.5. But we're saying that businesses that have an approved science-based target have a target that meets the minimum standard of Paris, well below 2 degrees. So hopefully that answers, to some extent, both of the parts of the question, but particularly the 1.5 versus 2 degrees part of the question. Cheers.
I'm a bit puzzled by the correlation with the 2 degrees, 1.5 degrees target setting, which has been a commitment by government. And all the demonstrations on setting science-based targets were all based on corporations and companies' inventories. So how do you connect the two? And how is that a science-based target that's correlated to national pledges or countries' pledges? Is there any correlation at all? Because I understand setting targets based on data can be considered a scientific approach, but I didn't see really the correlation or the connection with the 1.5 or 2 degrees reduction or limitation targets with setting a target internally as a company and the science base.
So when we say science-based, we mean two things. One, that it's a science-based methodology, and that it's in accordance with the science for limiting warming to well below 2 degrees worldwide. the science-based targets methodologies are not based on countries' nationally determined contributions, which are their 2025 or 2030 targets. They're simply based on the long-term goal of limiting warming to well below 2 degrees this century. And so the question, because anyone can use a scientific methodology to set an emissions reduction target, but that target could be consistent with a 4-degree world or a 6-degree world. It could be using a science-based methodology to calculate how much your emissions will rise rather than reduce. So there needs to be, as well as the scientific methodology, a scientific threshold of what is it we're aiming to achieve here. And what the international partners have endorsed is the Paris Agreement framing, or the Paris Agreement target. It is a thing for companies, not for countries. But one of my colleagues, Yako, a former colleague Yako, who used to run WWF's end of science-based targets, describes the Science-Based Targets Initiative as the Paris Agreement, but for companies. And so it's got the same 2 degrees, but rather than countries participating, it's a way for companies to commit to voluntarily set a set of targets to say that they're doing their bit for 2 degrees.
Look, I think this makes really good common sense. As we evolved through our program, we're going to find more and more challenges, and this is sort of a way to establish good standards. It's just good business. It's a good values-based business. It brings out the moral, ethical values of organisations going forward, of how we will all engage and deal with each other. I think we've got to think about the long-term vision. This is setting the standards for the young kids that are coming up behind us. They're going to have this. So, I think this is a no-brainer, personally.
Thank you. That's a really good note to end on. It is a no-brainer, but it does require quite a lot of brain engagement to get there. So it's just acknowledged that it isn't, there's a lot of challenges, and there's luckily lots of support and help both in this room in the form of companies who can offer support and colleagues who are going through these challenges. And I think David's point is a good one, and is a roundabout way of saying, if you come from my lens of the world, that you as business being here today and thinking about setting science-based targets are ahead of, for example, where some of country commitments are. And when that's the challenge that our current government is grappling with at the moment, and that we're going to hear more about very soon. So I'll wrap up on this note. Thank you so much for coming. The next time, a big piece of feedback I've heard is helping you with pitches to management. So when I pitch to 2 or 3 companies who I'd like to invite to have a chat to you, I'll ask them to cover that off as we pull together that content for next time. If there's anything else you'd like us to cover, drop me or David or Sean or Stu a line and let me know. Otherwise, thank you so much for being here. There are still a number of ginormous muffins left. So, sorry, live stream. So take one and feel free to stay. I think we've got this room through till about 12, but I know you'll all be gagging to rush back out in the rain and get on with your days. Thank you very much, and thanks to everyone on the live stream.